With me today is author extraordinaire. He's come out with a new book in one of my favorite genres. This is a genre I read for relaxation and fun. David Cleveland is who I'm talking about in his new book. Right here, I have it with me. Gods of Deception. Hopefully this is framed correctly and everyone can see it. David, thanks for joining me. Good to see you.
Good to be with you, Liz. I love your show.
So the interesting part of your book is that it's about something that is very true. It's about a trial that rocked our nation during the Cold War era. Your book, however, is a fictionalized version of that real life event. So tell us what's true about your book and what's fictionalized.
Well, most of it is true. 98% of it is all the facts. The story of the Alger Hiss trial intrigued me since I was a kid. And I remember Bill Buckley on Firing Line having incredible controversial conversations about who was telling the truth and who was lying. So that was a pretty interesting place to start. But once I got into the research on the book, things radically changed. One thing that was very quickly apparent was that Alger Hiss was not just a spy who happened to pass some State Department papers to Whittaker Chambers, his GRU, Soviet military intelligence handler in the late 30s. But it turns out that Alger Hiss was a very bad spy. He was an agent of influence. That is, he worked at the highest levels of the U.S. government. He sat at Roosevelt's right hand at Yalta, and he made sure that Stalin got everything that he wanted out of those Yalta agreements. And then there was even more that went on once I got into it, were the unexplained deaths and disappearances of potential witnesses at the Alger Hiss trial. These were people who fell out of 16-story windows on 45th Street, down a staircase at the Justice Department, disappeared behind the Iron Curtain in the late 40s and were not heard of, were not able to testify at the trial. It was quite clear that Stalin and his KGB operatives wanted to make sure that Alger Hiss was found not guilty and didn't give up the truth that he must have known was happening all the time.
So, and maybe you just answered this question preemptively, but this case did divide our nation at the time. There was a huge faction of people that thought Alger Hiss was guilty, a huge faction that thought he was not guilty, that he was a Soviet spy, he was not a Soviet spy. What's your opinion? Was he guilty? Was he a Soviet spy?
Well, we now know for certainty that he was indeed a Soviet spy. And what's more, he was a very bad spy, that he was an agent of influence. He influenced the Roosevelt administration to basically hand over to Stalin half of Eastern Europe, parts of East Asia. And a terrible thing that happened at Yalta was the agreement to return millions of Russian refugees almost to certain death. They had to be put in trains and cattle cars and turned over to Stalin's agents, where they were summarily executed. Terrible stuff that went on. But we also know now that Alger Hiss, along with his fellow spies in the White House, one by the name of Lachlan Curry, and in the Treasury Department by the name of Harry Dexter White, probably did unbelievable damage to this country. That would include sparking Pearl Harbor, the attack by the Japanese, the Korean War, and a number of other terrible events that came about by the influence of these spies in the highest reaches of the American government. We now know that it was not just Alger Hiss and a few others. There were 500 Soviet spies in the U.S. government and related war industries. That on top of 200,000 American Communist Party members, who basically the Communist Party provided the infrastructure for Soviet spying in the U.S. So you add all these things up, and you have a really, really bad business that did terrific damage to this country.
So tell me how this would have happened. Not necessarily how our government would have been infiltrated, but once these spies were embedded in the upper echelons of our government, how did they spark these events? These horrific, whether it's the Korean War, whether whether it's these enormous mass casualty type events, how were they able to influence U.S. foreign policy to that extent?
Well, let's just look at one case, Harry Dexter White, who was undersecretary at the Treasury Department, who was involved with Japanese affairs and putting pressure on the Japanese in the years before the Second World War in terms of putting restrictions on their ability to import oil and steel and that kind of thing. So one day in June 1941, Victor Pavlov, who was Harry Dexter White's handler in Washington, D.C., had a luncheon meeting with him at the old Eppett's Grill. He sat across from Harry Dexter White and pushed the paper across the table to Harry Dexter White and said, "I want you to memorize this." This was Operation Snow, put in place by Stalin and the KGB, which basically asked the U.S. government, or Harry Dexter White in this particular case, to ratchet up the pressure on the Japanese, push them and put more sanctions on them, with the idea that instead of attacking the Soviets in Siberia and Manchuria, where they'd had conflicts where tens of thousands of casualties occurred, to push the Japanese to go south, that is, into the Pacific and on to, obviously, Pearl Harbor. So Harry Dexter White, throughout the summer of 1941, pushed this program of pressurizing the Japanese and basically forcing them into a movement south as opposed to north, which is just what the Soviets wanted. They wanted Japan to attack south, which they did at Pearl Harbor, and the rest is history. So you might not be able to say that Harry Dexter White was single-handedly responsible for Pearl Harbor, but to have a person, one of Stalin's agents in the highest reaches of the American government, pushing a policy that the Soviets knew would impact Japan and encourage them to attack the Pacific and South. That's a pretty extraordinary situation. An agent of influence doing his darndest to hurt this country.
It's breathtaking, actually, to hear about it. It's shocking. How were these agents of influence able to reach the upper echelons of the U.S. government in this way? Well,
the fact is, most of them were well-educated types. Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Lachlan Curry, and others. They were all Harvard graduates. They were either undergrad law school or in some department of Harvard. They were the best and they were the brightest of their period. And basically, they were drawn to Stalin and the Soviet Union. They were willing agents. They were not paid. They came into it for ideological reasons. And basically, they thought that Stalin and the Soviet Union was the wave of the future. So the title of my book, Gods of Deception, they thought of themselves as demigods. That is, knowing better what this country wanted and where to go. And they were dead set on pushing this country in a Stalinist, socialist, communist direction. And they came pretty damn close to succeeding in many areas.
So where did they learn this ideology? Because I think oftentimes we think of traders as doing it for the money, and a lot of times traders are bought off by foreign nations. But if this was ideologically motivated, did they pick this ideology up from their families? Were they raised in this way? Were they associated with communist or Marxist or socialist or Stalinist groups, or was this something that they were brainwashed with, indoctrinated with at universities?
They picked this up on their own. As I mentioned earlier, by the 1930s, there were some 200,000 members of the American Communist Party. They had their propaganda outlets, all of which took their information from Moscow. They were not brainwashed. They went and they read Lenin and they read Marx, and they liked what they saw, and they were intent on fomenting an internal revolution in this country. They didn't expect to gain power by the ballot box, by democratic methods. by and large, the Communist Party wanted to overthrow the U.S. government. And the next best thing to overthrowing the U.S. government was to infiltrate the U.S. government at every level. And these were the best and brightest of their day. They were indoctrinated. They believed in Stalin. They believed in the Communist Manifesto. They were schooled in the dark arts of spycraft and lying and propaganda and all that kind of stuff. And basically, they were into identity politics. If you look at it from today, they divided the world up into the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, into the ruling class, and they believed in a world revolution in which the dictator of the proletariat was going to come along and take over the country. They were revolutionaries at heart, and the way they saw their best way in the late 30s and 40s was to infiltrate the highest reaches of the government. And they were even accommodated by many in the White House, Treasury, and the State Department who were not card-carrying communists per se, but were fellow travelers who kind of thought, their ideas were okay and maybe they would be helpful, little realizing the danger these agents of influence pose.
It kind of makes you wonder, what was that first spark that set them on that ideological path? Was it just coming across the Communist Manifesto? Was it a friend? Was it a college professor? What exactly was the first exposure to that tempted them and drew them in? I certainly wonder. It also shows us, I think, the impetus of protecting young people in our country against this ideology, teaching them that it's evil and teaching them what it is, the reality of the thing, so that they aren't sucked into this. But here's my question for you. So this is not that long ago, right? This is not that many years ago that our government was infiltrated by this many Russian or Soviet at the time spies. Is our government today vulnerable to this kind of infiltration?
Probably not vulnerable to infiltration from a foreign policy or card-carrying communist. But the scary thing I think about today is that the underlying process that the Communist Party and the Soviet Union used, that is disinformation, lies, big lies, false flags, and more than anything else, identity politics. That is dividing class against class, race against race, one part of society against another, name calling, all that kind of good stuff. That was the modus operandi of Stalin and the Soviets and the Communist Party. The Communist Party basically looked at the world through the lens of there were the exploiters and the exploited, and that you needed a revolution for one side to win. I think that kind of mentality, you have to realize that you had 200,000 members of the American Communist Party that basically disappeared from view in the early 50s when the US government caught wind, when the American people caught wind that there had been a lot going on in terms of communist infiltration. They disappeared. And then you had the Vietnam War. How many of those people protesting the Vietnam War were really against US involvement, and how many were actually supporting the communist North Vietnamese? And if you will, I think their sons and daughters today look on a world through a similar kind of lens. That is, again, is identity politics, that you beat up on other people, you designate groups that need to be either limited or somehow overcome. And it's that kind of sort of socialist attack mentality that I think has pervaded a lot of the country today, which is a kind of a residue of the late 30s and 40s of the years when the Communist Party was at its height in this country.
So what can we apply in our political era today from that case, from Alger Hiss, from the Communist Party that was here in the United States, from the infiltration of our government? What can we learn from this or apply to our politics today?
It seems to me that the real lesson from that period and from the Soviet period, even what you see Putin doing today in the Ukraine, Putin's big lie in the Ukraine was calling Ukrainians Nazis. He had to do the identity politics, and he had to basically tar and feather them with a horrible name as a rationale for attacking. You see in this country identity politics today, which basically tear at the foundations of the country. If you can get different groups fighting each other and calling each other out, what it tends to do is to weaken the society in general and weaken our politics in general. The idea that we're all at each other's throat 24/7. I think that, again, identity politics is basically the old ideology of the Communist Party that pitted one part of the economic classes against other parts. And I think for us today, we should take note of that and realize that we are much stronger as a unified country, that the problems that we all want to solve can be solved much better by a strong economy and being united as a people and proud of our heritage as opposed to tearing it down right and left.
I mean, we see a perfect example of that just this week. This isn't even a broad overarching generalized statement. We see the example of Black Lives Matter and the Kyle Rittenhouse situation. Kyle Rittenhouse is announced this week that he's going to sue media outlets for defamation because they tried to play identity politics. They tried to demonize him, calling him a white supremacist, and he's gonna sue. We talked about that over on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals this week, and just broke down exactly what happened and what the legal recourse for him is. So if you haven't seen that, highly recommend that you go over there. Also, if you use my promo code, you guys know this already, but if you use my promo code, you can get 1 month off your annual subscription. That's lizwheelershow.com/locals. You'll also get exclusive early access to interviews just like this, where I sit down and have these in-depth conversations with brilliant people like David. Here's my question about your research, your 5-year process too, is what part of your research regarding not just the Soviet part of the picture, but regarding the U.S. government part of the picture, what part of your research would surprise people the most about our government?
Well, I think the sad truth is that in the late 30s and the 40s, during the war years, when Soviet agents were infiltrating the U.S. government and going and reaching the highest levels of the U.S. government, that includes the White House, the State Department, Treasury, that the FBI was very inept in terms of being able to root out these people. But more importantly, I think the saddest aspect of this is that the general population, in many respects, was vaguely or actively supportive of what the Communist Party wanted, which was a radical program for redistribution of wealth in this country and an overthrow of the democratic government and the imposition of a more socialist way of doing things. And this was the period of the Great Depression. So this was a time of great hardship in America and, in a sense, an openness to radical solutions to the Great Depression. But I think the saddest thing is how vulnerable the U.S. government was, and it came very, very close to not just possibly being taken over by a socialist regime, but cozying up to the Soviet Union and other things that were equally devastating. One of the most devastating, in fact, was a spy that had infiltrated the U.S. Army intelligence by the name of William Wiesband. He was in the top echelons of U.S. Army intelligence, and he realized that the U.S. had actually broken the Soviet military codes, whereby they were allocating their military resources throughout Asia. And he tipped off his Soviet handlers that the U.S. was reading Soviet military intelligence. That left us in the dark. We did not realize that Stalin was sending men and material to North Korea in preparation for a war against South Korea. If William Wiesband had not tipped off his Soviet handlers we would have known that Stalin was planning a war in Korea. We would have stood up to Stalin ahead of time, warned him that we would intervene if he did so, and probably prevented the Korean War. So that is a case where one spy in one top U.S. agency was able to precipitate a world war, a Korean War, which resulted in the deaths of 50,000 Americans. So that just gives you one sense of how devastating the infiltration of the U.S. government was at that period.
And imagine that, the FBI being vulnerable to corruption by socialists, Marxists, communists. As probably King Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. That certainly applies to the FBI of today. David, this is so fascinating. I could sit here and talk to you about this all day, but I encourage everyone, get his book, Gods of Deception. Really well done, really thrilling, just completely relevant to today, but in and of itself, just a really good book. Congratulations on the success of this book, and thank you for sitting down with me. As always, if you want exclusive early access to interviews just like this one before everyone else, join us on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. It's lizwheelershow.com/locals, and my promo code ACCESS will get you 1 month free on your annual subscription. David, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Liz. It was a pleasure.
If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.